Please welcome Connie Duckworth.
Thanks, Patrick. I'm going to just make a couple of introductory comments, and then I have a short DVD to show you, because I know this is a very visual group, and I think that nothing tells the story of Afghanistan like some of the pictures that you see. And all of this footage that you'll see we shot in the field, with the exception of the tanks firing that came from the BBC. So how did I get here to this conference? I'm still scratching my head, other than Patrick invited me. But I think that the design thinking process is so applicable to the bottom of the pyramid, and I know I've learned a lot from being here. How did I get from Wall Street to Afghanistan? That's another sort of odd story. But the dichotomy of this world is going from probably the most high-tech information, human capital-driven business there is, which is Wall Street firms, global in nature, instantaneous communication networks, to working in a world where, if I were looking at Bill's chart, and he's reversed the pyramid, countries, post-conflict countries like Afghanistan are this little, like the towers that stick up from the Sears Tower. They're on the very top, because even the most basic rules of engagement in trying to build private sector activity somewhat don't apply. And so as a result, there's been a traditional influx of what I would call true NGO or sort of supranational kind of money that pours into these countries. And it creates a very odd and distorted market dynamic. In Afghanistan, that's represented by the fact that billions of dollars of aid, well-meaning aid, have poured into Kabul and created a Wild West. Anyone who speaks English, even small amounts of English, who are Afghan, command 10 times the salary of a local, irrespective of skill level. So you've got a disproportionate degree of the intellectual capital in the country serving basically in the lowest level capacities of big international NGOs. It skews the real estate market. It skews the market for services, goods and services, and what gets actually made and imported into the countries. And in a weird sort of way, once we figured this out, and the first 10% of our weavers we actually have in a sort of slummy, underserved area outside of Kabul. But once we figured out how hard it is to work in Kabul because of all these distortions, we moved to the rural areas. So 90% of our activity goes on in places with no roads. Most of the villages, and there are 10 of them now, we have about 700 people employed. None of them are, most of them aren't accessible in the winter because not only are there no roads, but you really can't get there when the weather turns bad. You know, this is a country that has no electrical grid, so let alone in Kabul. You go out there, you're working in trying to come up with a business that works that has no electricity. Well, if you have no electricity, that means you don't have any form of communication. If you don't have any electricity, you can't really do much in the way of telephony. And there are parts of Afghanistan where we work where there aren't even cell phones. And we determined very quickly it's too expensive to use satellite phones. So as a result, when our staff goes into the field, we just don't hear from them for about a week. There's just this missing, 17 minutes. And there's no heat. There's no water. And as Bill pointed out, there's an enormous lack of human capital that have been developed. And that, to me, is the biggest need in Afghanistan and countries like that, is training local people to develop a skill set that can be deployed in a business to start some kind of private sector activity. So with that introduction, I think what we'll do is I'll show the video. This we put together about 2 years ago when we were really very heavily focused on the supply chain. And again, supply chains in Afghanistan are interesting because there are various middlemen throughout the process, which we actually are trying to disintermediate. So when people say, what's Arzu? I actually say we're the ultimate middleman. But we're set up as a 501c3. We run ourselves like a business, and that has been since day one. But when you're in a gender-segregated society and part of your supply chain is male and part of it's female, and the two cannot talk, that creates some interesting business dynamics. And you thought internal communication in your own companies was strange or strained at times. And then we also have a workforce that is largely prohibited from leaving their home to work. So that's another constraint that was put on the business. So with that, I'll show this, and then I'll go into the lessons learned and how I think I'm actually quite positive and optimistic about this very much basement of the bottom of the pyramid.
Like its backbone, the magnificent Hindu Kush mountain range, Afghanistan is a country of stark contrast and extraordinary history. A country caught in the cross-currents of war for centuries. A nation of nearly 30 million people, united by that history, and torn apart by its repercussions.
Can you all hear this? No.
Can you bring it up with the mic? Can you bring it up with the mic?
A beautiful people with a tragic past who, like all people, dream of a better future for themselves, their families, their communities, their country.
I'm just going to start.
Yep, just start it. But it really, I think, hits on the themes that we very much learned from the very bottom up in our test tube. And that's very much how I think about Arzu. I could not have predicted 5 years ago that I would be a rug merchant today, which is how I define myself. And one of my former partners told me recently that if I were a guy in New York, I'd have a card table on the corner, and he's not far from wrong. What Arzu really has given me is an extraordinary opportunity to create an experiment in social entrepreneurship. And that really is the merger of the for-profit, money-making, private sector business approach and a social benefit mission. And what's talked about, because there's no good name for this kind of enterprise yet. There are a lot of little micro experiments going on. But what I find interesting and surprising is that this little peanut of an experiment in Afghanistan has been watched by any number of major international NGOs and sort of quasi-governmental organizations, because of how effectively we have been able to get things done on the ground. And I think we've been referred to as a possible template for post-conflict reconstruction in white papers. I think of this as a little rug business, but then that's very much what we've thought of it from day one. So it's kind of like an R&D lab. But I want to say I completely agree with Bill's point that the solution to major global problems of poverty, lack of education, lack of access to health care, all of the kinds of bad news stories that we hear every single day in the press, I believe that they are insolvable without the private sector's participation. And the way I look at the world, I think there are four sectors. I think there's the private sector, which is extremely efficient. And it's the private capital of the world, and we all know the impact and power that that can wield. We have the public sector, which in my mind should be making decisions about war and peace and international relationships, trade and otherwise. We have the third sector, which is the NGO, sort of multinational organization sector, which from 30,000 feet I think is very effective at thinking about and articulating good policy for the world. But this new sector is the most exciting to me, which is what I would call the fourth sector or the for-benefit corporation. And what it really is the private sector designed to make a profit, but oh, by the way, the profit is reinvested in communities or into social benefit programs. So what we're trying to do with Arzu in one country with one product is to really create a self-funding mechanism for development projects. So as you saw, there's a deal. If you want to weave for Arzu and get the 50% cash bonus for the correct quality, because of course there are quality cuts in this, then you have to put your kids in school. And oh, by the way, that includes the girls. You also have to make sure that every woman in the household, from grandma down to teenage bride, because they live in big clans, has to attend literacy classes that Arzu will set up in the particular village. We count and track all the pregnant women. Maternal death rate is the single largest governmental health issue and priority in the country. In effect, there is no access to any kind of health care for women who are pregnant and delivering. So if you need a cesarean for any even most basic reason, you just die because there's no place for you to go. And if there were a place for you to go, and it's a clinic an hour away with no road in the most heavily landmined country in the world, you wouldn't get there anyway. Or even if you could get there, most likely your family wouldn't take you because they aren't convinced that you need a doctor. So one of the parts of the deal is we keep track of all the pregnant women in all of our family groups, and it's about 2,500 people now in total, and we take them. We take them for pre- and postnatal checkups in a four-wheel drive vehicle, and we keep track of the immunizations the babies receive, and we take them back for those. We escort them. Now, the only reason we can do these things at the village level is because we have taken the time to build trusted relationships with villagers. And when we go into a new village, we basically don't work there unless we have had the village elders say we can work there. We meet with them first. We explain the rights and responsibilities of weaving for Arzu. And what's very rewarding to us is that as our reputation has spread locally, we get delegations of village elders coming to us asking Arzu to come to their village, which for us are small victories. We also offer, but don't require, men's literacy classes. And we've had a couple of delegations of men in some of our villages say, can we have literacy classes too? And we take those as small victories. Obviously, we're very entertained by small victories. But I think what I didn't know when I started this effort was, first of all, I knew absolutely nothing about international development. I knew nothing about Afghanistan, and I knew nothing about rugs. And all of those things were probably not a bad thing, because I really wasn't saddled with any legacy issues from the past, and I know that's been brought up in some of the panels yesterday. What I did know is that I wanted to create a new mechanism, a self-funding mechanism, and just like a startup business, you invest seed capital, you grow it. Our mantra this year is cash flow positive or bust, and we mean that both sort of figuratively and literally. Because we got to about 50% of the way to cash flow positive this past year. It took us we've been producing about 2.5 years. It took us 1.5 years to get a production scaled to the scale where we can break even. And now we've turned our focus on the distribution side, which at the end of the day, as challenging as it may seem to run a supply chain in Afghanistan, this is actually the crux of the matter, and I knew that all along. I came from a distribution business. There's a much bigger opportunity, I think, if we can make this model work in one country, in one product, and that is that there are literally women-made artisanal crafts in almost every really poor country in the world, and they're often run by very good NGOs. They're not run like businesses, but they're run with close ties to the community. And so frankly, if you can develop the distribution NUCO and the brand, which I think is critical, and what are the brand values for an Arzu product? Well, highest quality, that comes first. When you say not-for-profit and you name a product, most people immediately think tribal tchotchke, the beaded hand purse, the painted mask, the embroidered shirt, none of which there is an export market for, a sustainable export market. So you have to figure out what the craft is at the highest quality, how you can authentically translate that into a product for which there is a market, a real market, and then connect these handcrafted goods that are inaccessible to the market, to the biggest consumer markets in the world, which happen to be us in the United States. And so I do think that there's an opportunity for a roll-up if we can get the economics working and right in this one small test tube that we've been conducting. I will say also, when we went into this, we were completely product agnostic. I didn't know anything about rugs. It was on a research basis first, and so I didn't realize until I heard Jim Hackett's talk yesterday, but I guess we really are doing design thinking, in that we thought about it for a long time, developed a point of view, took a lot of time in planning our implementation. So we probably worked at this for close to 1.5 years before we ever approached a village to produce rugs. And then we solved all of the little and large production and supply chain problems and quality control problems. One of the things we do is we have the little Arzu H for hope put in the corner. We ask the weaver to put that in the corner of every rug. So it's one of the branding things. It's fun. You can find the H in your Arzu rug. Well, you can imagine we got rugs with like giant 3-foot H's in them, you know. Those actually sold because people thought they were so fun. But you know, it took a while to get the kinks out, but quality is really important. So now, as in the last year, we've turned to the branding and distribution side. During our scaling up process, we were really able to sell direct to the consumer has been our approach, and direct to the architectural and design trade. And the first phase, we've been able to sell largely through trunk shows, friends of Connie's, friends and friends of Connie's. In fact, if you know me, you most likely own an Arzu rug. Even if you don't know me, you most likely own an Arzu rug if you've ever come in contact with me. But that only lasts for a certain period of time, and we really need to institutionalize the distribution, which we have always felt would be through the architectural and design community. Hence, in comes ID. because they did this, several of the students, and I know I saw Amanda here earlier, did this wonderful project and presentation for us. And specifically, the question we asked was, how do we approach the architectural and design trade, which, again, from a quality perspective, would be the right audience for us. And they found, after running through their various models, an interesting inconsistency in our own marketing materials, and have encouraged us to stress the design element over the mission element, so that we will approach our branding from highest quality, authenticity of design materials. You can see that the wool is hand-spun, natural dye, hand-dipped, and oh, by the way, it's green. It's a green product. So, and it also is sustaining traditional historic patterns that have been increasingly lost because of the warfare. And then, oh, by the way, you're also helping to save the world, because that rug that you just bought to put in your office or under your living room employed a family of 8 for a year. We keep detailed data on what they do with the money, so we know who made your rug, and we share that with you. We know what their lives were like before, and what the impact of weaving and having a market for their product. Currently, the rug industry, as you know, globally, is one of the most exploitative horror shows of an industry that exists. National Geographic prominently featured it as 21st century slavery in an article a couple of years ago. And so the good thing about starting in a country where there is nothing, and this is a country that totally is a disaster of epic proportion on every front. Economically, civil society-wise, there's no rule of law, there are no institutions, no one's literate who stayed in the country. Their life expectancy is among the lowest in the world, and it's an ecological disaster because it's been deforested. So with all those problems, one of the things they don't have is they don't have a lot of factories, and they don't have a lot of rug factories, so that's a good thing. So you play the hand you're dealt, and that's this cottage industry vibrancy that we are working to develop. So I guess the last things I've learned through this process, other than, you never can quite predict where life will take you, is I truly do believe in the power of the markets. I do believe it is the power of the markets that will change lives and ultimately change the lives of the people in the BOP. I am a bit of a Keynesian in the theory that in the long run we're all dead, so you need to have something that productive that people can do today while you're educating their children, so that the next generation will be the teachers, will be the doctors. We had one weaver tell us, I weave so my daughter won't have to. And I think that investment in the future is a long-tail investment, but one that will bear fruit. I also have come to conclude that the right to work is a true basic component of human dignity. And when we have symbolically, because women in Afghanistan still basically have no human rights, so just as policy, and we truly make this up as we go along, and we do everything only after consulting our customers on the ground at the most basic level, but we pay the money, the cash, because it is an informal cash economy, into the hands of the woman. Well, what that does, with nothing else having been said, is it changes her power, the balance of power in the household, and her status rises with nothing being said, because she is now probably the only wage earner in the household of 8, 10, 12 people, and certainly the largest wage holder. So when her husband beats her, we hope it happens a little less frequently, but it does shift the balance of power and human rights. And then lastly, as I said before, I really do believe that private sector skills, private sector approaches, thinking, design thinking, are absolutely critical to solving these problems. I do feel, as an American and having traveled extensively to some of these very sort of odd places, that weight of the 4 billion people above us. And I think it's imperative to our future and to our children's future to come up with some workable solutions. So I think I'll end with that, and just one other note, which I'm wholly confident of, and that is that every person in this room has a floor somewhere that will look better. Will look better, I assure you, with an Arzu rug on that floor.
Thank you, Connie. We have time for maybe one question or two, if there are any. Yes, in the middle. Do we have a mic?
Oh. Yeah, excuse me. I'm sorry.
Mic is on its way.
I'll switch sides on you.
I actually had two questions. First one was, I noticed a lot of the people you showed were Hazara, and I'm wondering whether you had difficulties with some of the social groups, or some of the tribal groups that you didn't with others, whether you were more accepted in some places than in others.
The answer to that question is yes, there are distinct tribal differences. And for those, how many people read The Kite Runner in here? Well, the Hazara were the servant family, and they, by definition, have been the most discriminated against class of people historically throughout Afghanistan's 5,000-year-old history. And they live in Bamiyan, where those big Buddhas were blown up. And so they were treated particularly harshly by the Taliban, who are fundamentalist Sunni. So, but what we found, actually, with the Hazara specifically, is that they are among the more open-minded. And I think that's because they have perhaps fallen the farthest. We also work largely in northern Afghanistan, which is Turkmen and Uzbek, largely, and a mix of others. There's, I don't know, it's 25 or 26 major tribes. They are more conservative there, and we have to factor that into our dealings because, and it's a funny story, in the north we have male staff and we have female staff who interact with their family because the men meets with the men and the women meet with the women. And we were getting these reports and we couldn't figure out why these reports, you know, it was like, what is the problem? Are they not talking to each other? Well, that was the answer, in fact. Our staff could not speak to each other because they weren't related. So we solved that problem by hiring a nephew who also knew the computer and how to do certain things on the computer, and then that solved our internal communication problems. So there's a million things like that. And I'll tell you one other just funny story because I find it so interesting coming from the background I've come from. When we started, there's no banking system in Afghanistan. So the question is, how do you move money? It is a cash economy. And at first, we were wiring money into Pakistan, and somebody was bringing it across on their person. And then they opened a central bank, and we could wire it into Kabul. But then someone went to the bank and put, $10,000 on their person, which is not a safe thing to do, and traveled around the country. But until we got tipped off that we could use the Hawala system. Well, the Hawala system is literally the money changers in the marketplace, biblical kind of system. And so we got a referral to a Hawala, and this money, we call up our Hawala, we say, we need $10,000 on Tuesday in Andhoy, and Tuesday our staff shows up and some guy walks up and gives them $10,000, for which we are charged only 1.5%. And American Express charges us 3% on our credit cards here when we sell a rug. So there are always solutions, and it's actually been one of the most intellectually interesting things I've ever seen. Did you have a second question, or was that?
I did. The second question was, how do you determine how much to pay?
There is an actual going rate per square meter for different qualities and different kinds of weaves, and different tribes weave different kinds of things. And so again, it's all been learning about what is the local economy, because the last thing we want to do is disrupt the local economy. So we work as a base case off the local rates, which vary by region and again by tribe and by style of weaving. And then we just pick the number 50% out of the air. because it sounded like a lot. And it is a lot to these people, and that's what we go with. And then we've run all of our pro formas and our models based on that as one of our costs. And the other thing I did learn from this conference is that we really are one of the free, we're the free economies of abundance. There's abundant labor, abundant poverty, and abundant opportunities in Afghanistan. It just takes a lot of trial and error and patience to get at the solutions, the local solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Connie.